Hi everyone, my name is Leonie. I'm a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And together with my former colleague and friend Adelina Chandra, we are the organizer of this session about women, minorities, and the path to sustainable land use. I have a background in bioinformatics, and I also do a lot of data analysis and work with remote sensing. But during my PhD, I got interested in gender questions and investigated gender dynamics mostly in the cattle ranching sector in Brazil. And I think that maybe that relates to a lot of you as well. Gender dynamics are like very abundant in all our study regions and also in our daily lives as researchers and human beings. So I think it's just a topic that relates to all of us and that is a little bit understudied and not yet well developed in our research field as maybe some of us want it to be. Just to quickly give a little introduction about gender. So in gender theory, we see that there are like these two gaps that we might fall into. So one is that we kind of try to, start to like essentialize women and say that they're have like a better connection or a more thorough and more greater connection to nature, such that they're like the heroines of nature and are the solution to our environmental problems. And then on the other hand, there's this trap that we try to victimize women and just portray them as minorities or the oppressed. And I think it's very important to look at this in a more nuanced way, and find solutions for a more equitable world in general. Also, this is gender is also like only one dimension, and the same thing also applies for other minority groups like indigenous people and local communities that also tend to be stereotyped or grouped in certain ways of living. And we should just look closer to it, and that's why we're all here. So we look forward to like a good two very interesting presentations. One will be more quantitative, and the other one more qualitative. And after that, we have plenty of time to discuss 3 research questions that we prepared. And we will open up that discussion so that everyone can participate.
So let me start with the first presenter. It's Eunice Adwoa Sarpong. So Eunice is a PhD student affiliated with University of Paracau and George August University Göttingen. Eunice's research explores local innovation and the impact of land reforms on land use, rights, and tenure security in northern Benin in respect to gender, agriculture, and food security using ethnographic approach. So I will give the floor to Eunice. I hope this works.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. All right, now that we have a basis for the definition of gender, I will continue. So for today's topic, I'll be looking at a gender perspective on rural land reform and household food security in Chauru in northern Benin. I'd like to acknowledge that my research is funded by the Declare project, and this project is sponsored by the German Ministry of Federal Education. I also want to acknowledge or say a special thank you to the Global Land Program for making my participation in this year's conference or sponsoring me to participate. So for today's agenda, briefly, we'll look at what the land reform is in Benin. I'm sure most of us have an understanding of what land reform is, but in this context, we will look at it what the Benin's land reform aims to achieve, so the objectives. Then I'll talk, I think we already mentioned that my approach is ethnography. We don't have much time to talk about positionality, and hopefully in the discussion, if there are questions that emerges, we will have a look at it. This I will do through a case study. So we'll go into a detailed case study to look at how the land reform translates on ground. Then after the end, there will be lots of questions because the land reform opens up lots of questions or where we can all contribute to. So I will start by looking at the institutionalization of land reform in Benin. So by land reform in Benin, what the Benin government seeks to do is to formalize land rights. So by formalizing land rights, it takes two forms. One, it has to do with reforming the land administrative bodies. And two, it also has to do with individualizing land rights, or what we call privatization of land rights. The debate started in 1990, and between 2007 and 2013, there has been two reforms. Let me add that the implementation is in its process, so it has not fully been implemented, and the implementation is also a bit slow. So, as I mentioned, it looks at privatizing individual land rights. And as most of you know, when we talk about land system in Africa, it has been based on collective ownership. So how does this work in reality? So first, we consider that the legal framework or the land reform ignores the fact that land system in Benin is embedded in, or it's a bundle of rights, let me put it that way. So in this case, how does the local people who anticipate that there's going to be a full implementation of a reform, how do they go about their land activities? And this will bring us to our objective for today. So the question we are asking is how local people organize their life in relation to the land. By this, we are looking at land access, land use, ownership, and also sustainable land management. So our entry to discuss this is to look at the land reform. But of course, I acknowledge that the land reform is not the only factor. It also intersects with other factors as well, such as population growth, religion, very important, religion, I'll come to that later, and climate change. So, my context. I mentioned that I'm working in Chauru commune, and I'm focusing on one village in this particular presentation. So the village is Buku Sera, and briefly the characteristics is that it's a Fulani sedentary agro-pastoralist. So I mentioned Christianity or religion is important. And the political structure is patrilineal. Interesting here is that the Fulanis practice endogamous marriage, that is getting married within themselves. So it's like parallel cousins, if most of you know the background to Fulanis. With their land use, of course, so far as there is pastoralism, there is agriculture, it brings up so many competitive use for the land. So how do they do it then? This is a quote from one of my focus group discussions. The Fulanis, the men, let me put it this way, said that the land registration, here we are looking at the land reform, but in the local level, the land reform translates into parceling of land, registration of land. It's at the national level that it goes into a land title, because land titling is expensive. So in most cases, at the rural level, we are looking at recognizing customary possessions. And in most cases, some of them have not even gone through that process yet. They have just started to parcel the lands. It's due to so many factors. It can be due to litigations on who settled first. It can also be as a result of financial limitations. So this is one of the quotes they told me, the men. Land registration is not new to us Fulanis. We knew this day would come. That's why whenever we farmed on a piece of land, we planted trees there. It's our way of marking the land and asserting our ownership. If you have a history or if you have a background about nomads and pastoralism, you realize that they live in an uncertain world. So always they are envisaging what is going to happen. Because Fulanis are being stereotyped that they don't own lands. So always they look for avenues to claim or own land. So that's why they mentioned they have not been surprised. They have been, let me say, in the future or predicted the future. Briefly, we see here the land reform in practice by looking at a land tenure mapping. This we did in the village. We took an aerial view of the village, then we mapped it using pencils and markers that people could easily mark their tenure. And it's surprising that the locals have a deep knowledge of their boundaries, and they did this for us. So now let's see how the land the land reform it's in practice, or how it's supposed to be implemented. So let's assume that people have parceled their land. So over there you see it. People have parceled their lands. Each family has it. So for my unit of analysis, we see community lands, we see family lands, and individual lands. Don't forget I explained that their political structure, it's embedded in social relations. So you can be an individual, but you belong to a family and you come from a community. So we are going to use one of the lands that have been parceled or that have been measured. Let's say we are taking III 12.1 over here. Okay, so let's say this land in a scenario is for Dauda. And Dauda is an old man, 75 years old, who has 6 sons and he has 12 hectares of land. Now, land in the Fulani or their cultural system is passed over through the male lineage. So Dauda will give this land to his 6 sons. And let me also add that the 6 sons, it's not automatic that all the sons, irrespective of their age, so age intersects here. If you are not married, if you are not considered a full-grown man. So in this case, your brothers or your uncles can even take custody of your land till you are considered a full-grown man. So Dauda shares his land for his sons, and we are going to consider a detailed case on Ali. So Ali has 1 wife, and he gets 7 hectares of this land. So because of our time, I'll not talk much about the social relations, but keep it in mind that in the Fulani household, they all live in the same, what we call gure. So it's like a hamlet. And once your father is alive, or even if he passes on, all the sons will form their hamlet around the father's compound. So it still shows that they have this strong kinship bonds and collective responsibility, even towards the use of the land. So now we look at our scenario. So now Ali has 7 hectares of land. What does Ali do? So I mentioned that the Fulanis had earlier mentioned that they use the trees to assert ownership to a land. And now we see cashew trees. So if you can see the legend, we have cashew trees. There's an increase in cashew plantation in northern Benin. So that will be the second thing after cotton now. And the choice for cashew plantation, it's diverse. It's not one dimension. In the case of Fulani, some of the reasons they give for using or going so much into the cashew plantation is because the land that they have settled on is infertile. It have been sedentarized for more than a century. So it's infertile. That is one. Another reason is that trees assert ownership of land. So if they are into conflict with other ethnic groups, let's say the Bariba, the Nago, then once they have, there's informal way of settling it. Once they look at a tree, they can be able to say, oh, this tree is so old. If it's your grandfather who planted it, it means it's for you. So now let's see here. Ali has assigned 4 hectares of land to his cashew plantation. Then he has assigned some parts to food production. Then over there, he gives his wife. Here too, there's dynamics in it, in the sense that a woman is considered a visitor. The Fulani word is kodo. In the early stages of marriage. So in the early stages, you are considered as a kodo or a visitor to the family. But once a woman gets to a certain stage, or let's say after 20 years of marriage or 30 years of marriage, or when there's no signs of divorce, hardly do the Fulanis divorce though. But when there's no signs that the woman is going to leave, then the man can decide to assign a piece of land, that is cashew land, to the wife. But in the early stages of marriage, the man can also decide that, let me give half a hectare, but these are negotiable to my wife, and my wife decides. But some of the women have mentioned to me that the men barely have enough. How can they give to them? Because don't forget, the land hasn't increased, population have increased, and it's the men who are going to share the land. So what does this tell us about the land use patterns over there? So I mentioned to you that the assumption, or the underlying assumption of the reform, is to ensure tenure security for marginalized groups. Again, it's also to ensure gender equality. Again, it's also to make sure that there is food production and it reduces poverty. But what does this scenario tell us? The scenario, of course, makes us understand that if the land reform is fully implemented, it's going to ensure a systematic change. And this systemic change it will be at the let me say at the top level, so it doesn't focus on individuals. If it doesn't focus on individuals, the assumption is that once land is passed on to the male son, he has responsibility to take care of the wife, the children, and the youth. But that does not what it translates in practice. It means that much power is now given to the male or given to the man in his role as a husband. We also see that it weakens the bundles of land rights, like flexible use of the land that was formerly used by the locals. So because of our time, I'll just go on to our discussion. So if we are looking at the three, let's say, objectives of the reform: inequality. We realize that once the land reform is being done, now males are going to get land certificates to their land, and this land certificate will be registered in their name. On an assumption that we don't know, certain things can happen. A man can pass on. It means that now the land is in the name of the man, and in most cases, the woman needs to return back to her natal or her family home. Again, women too have found innovative ways to make sure they contribute to household food security by doing gardening. But one thing we see that with the individualization of lands, most women are now doing so. They have not formed this solidarity or collective farming, but rather they are in the logic of the state of having individual farms. So we see that Fulani women, again, they barely question this order, because both men and women consider this social order as a natural or God-given. How then can we integrate these viewpoints? Because like when we look at hegemonic forces to equality, we are looking at gender equality means that we have same rights for men and women. But in this case, in the perceptions or in the minds of the people, they consider this order as a natural order. So then that's where I ask, how do we use these empirical findings to inform policy? Or how does us as social scientists consider these empirical findings? Because the way people have been lived, or the way they are living, it's affected by the way, or it's affected by their history, their culture, religion, and now we see the land reform. So how then do we get there? How do we integrate local perspectives? Because of our time, I'll move on in the discussion session. If there are other questions, I'll bring it on. So our two take-home message is that our connection of saying a land reform ensures gender equality is being challenged here, as we see that there are complexities in the implementation process. Again, mostly when we are talking about land reform, we make advances that women have progressed, or women's land rights have progressed in terms of access. But when we look at this scenario, it tells us that we should only see access as one step, but it's superficial. Because in the death of a husband, this access, or anything can happen, this access goes. Or once the land reform is implemented, it means that things that were flexible, how the Fulanis had lived, how they have negotiated power, all will be changed. And lastly, it also increases power asymmetries between people who are migrants, people who are the youth, and also for the women. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for the presentation. Amazing presentation. Are there any questions for Eunice? Maybe you can stay here, Eunice. Yeah. I'm going to go to the lady over there.
Thank you, Eunice, for such a thought-provoking presentation. I was wondering if you found any difference on the use of the land once it's assigned or given to women, and whether there are any crops that you've found are specifically sort of women-led, and if that's of interest for poverty reduction and food production.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question, and so that's one of the things that we assume. When I say we assume, that's theory assumes that women, I think that's the introduction, that women are heroines when it comes to nature. So we ask ourselves in scenarios, let's say we give a woman 10 hectares of land, like how he has to a man. How is he going to use this land? Because now we cannot really predict what exactly the woman will use the land for, because in this case, they don't have that hectares of land. But we can see that the little hectares of land that they are putting it into sustainable use. So they are applying organic manure, they are doing vegetable gardening, they have tomatoes, so they have a lot of things happening over there. But as of now, we cannot really, so it calls for more research. We cannot really tell. Let me see, if I give a woman 10 hectares of land, is she going to go into cashew plantation? Because she has school fees to pay. She has other responsibilities to also take care of. So I think that's where we have gaps between theory and what really happens. So let's give a woman 10 hectares of land, and let's give her 5 years and see what will happen. whether as theory tells us that women are heroines. In some cases it's there, we have seen it. But in my case study, we cannot conclude yet because the women are not owners of these lands.
Okay, just gonna go to this, the one in front.
Thank you, Eunice, for the inspiring presentation. It's really nice, and it is like motivate me also next time when I eat cashew. I need to be careful. Like, it's really very interesting. It's like the same scenario around Africa. I'm just wondering, do the women inherit their husband or do they inherit their father? Like, I believe that in this Fulani community, you said they are Christian.
Yes.
Yeah. So do they have like the woman can inherit from her husband or from her father? Like the father only gives the son, or he can give also for the son and daughter? And I'm also curious about the future perspective of the woman, like the girls. Do they see themselves like they're gonna continue to be in the village, or they just want to move? Like for girl and boys in this scenario, do they will gonna continue to be in the same land, manage it the same way their father do, or they just imagine themselves as they're gonna be immigrant to capital or to outside or something like that?
Thank you very much. I think that's where we need a generational analysis to the land reform implementation. And it's very interesting, the question you asked, because in my focus group discussion with the youth, a girl just raised up her hand and she questioned them and said, why is it that you are not giving us the girls' land? But when I did focus group with the women, I'll say they even dare not to ask such questions. It has not even come to their thinking yet to question the other. But these are girls who have gone to school. These are girls who have seen the other. So I think that the awakening is coming. But as it stands, we cannot judge them because we are not in their context. Why they chose it that way? Because to them, they want to protect family lineage. The woman is considered to be leaving the home. So then we cannot give you a land whilst you go to your husband's home. But the awakening is there. The girls are starting to ask these questions. And I think on the first question you asked whether the inheritance is passed through the... Yes, so with Fulanis, it's very interesting. Fulanis have both, so in my context, it's agro-pastoralist, so they have cattle. So the good thing is that they give women cattle. Once you are getting married, you get one cow. So you are supposed to give the cow in the herd of your husband. But of course, it also shows power dynamics. A woman does not have, though she owns the cow, because it's the husband who will bring the cow as a dowry to marry her. She does not have the right to decide what to do with that cow. If, let's say, she wants to sell it, she does not have absolute control to this cow. So for them, they don't inherit land, but a woman is given a cow and kept in the husband's herd.
Yeah, just one more. Please pass.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for your presentation. By the way, I'm from Benin, and what she's talking about, I know much. But I want to talk about your quote on land registration and the dynamic of perennialization through tree planting that you've shown. And I wonder which one is coming first, right? The Fulani, we know they don't own land historically, and they are even considered migrants in those contexts. So have they started planting the trees in anticipating the land registration, or which one is coming first? And who even give them the right to plant trees? Because planting trees on a land that you haven't inherited long time ago can be problematic. So this is like a kind of politics of perennialization and claiming land, as you're saying. And what is tenure security for those communities? Because I think we have different understanding of what security means in those contexts, right?
Thank you so much. That is so true. So what happens is that I mentioned that there is a historical perspective to this Fulanis that I'm working with. So these Fulanis, long time ago, over 200 years, their forefather had migrated from the Sahel and had come to help the Baribes, in Chachu, for war during those moments. So once their forefathers had helped, they gave the man a piece of land. And that time, how people gain piece of land is once you farmed on the land, then you don't leave the land bare. So the Baribes, when they are farming, knew that, because it's for them. Once they are farmed, they knew this is our land. So the Bariba man will farm here and just leave the land. But once they gave this lands to their forefathers, and now the Fulanis are in the minority, once they knew that I come to you, so there's flexible negotiations. You say that you're giving me this land. In those ages, land was not so scarce. So people give land without even thinking, documentation, nothing at all. So once they gave them the land, the Fulanis in their thinking knew that in future, because they have been already stereotyped that they are not from, let's say, in Benin or coming from Ghana or whatever part of Africa, they have been assumed as coming from other parts of Africa. So once they settled and they farmed, when they are even leaving the piece of land for fallow, they don't leave it bare. They planted trees, and those were indigenous trees they planted to assert ownership. And now, when cashew plantation had come, let me put it that when their second money, because cow is a Fulani identity, their second money, which is cashew, had come, then all that they needed to do was to now take over those indigenous trees and then plant the cashew trees. Again, Fulanis also ask for land for their cattle. So when they come, it's so easy to give them land. And before they can graze on that field, they need to cut trees. So that's also one of the strategies they were able to accumulate land. So they'll cut all the trees before they can be able to plant, let's say, forage, or before their cattle can be able to graze. So by all these strategies, they accumulated land. Of course, it's now bringing issues of who settled first. Because of the land reform, the Baribes are saying that you are not the owners, the Nagos are saying you are not the owners, and some cases are even in the courts as we speak now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eunice, for awesome presentation.
I have two questions. So the first one is for Danielle, the second one is for both of you. So looking at your socioeconomic parameters that you use, I wonder, based on like the presentation from Eunice, religion play a very important role also on like the gender access to land or the gender, So I wonder if you include that in your parameters, and if so, what did you find related to like the different characteristics of religion? And my second question for both of you, religion and culture, values play a very important role in women's access to land. So officially there are regulations and new regulations reform who are trying to support women access, changing and shifting the way the policies are written, but that's officially. And as a woman coming from Africa, I know that what is happening officially on text is not a representation exactly on what is on the land or like in the communities. And even though there are reforms, sometimes rural community very far away of like urban area or access to information are not really aware about it. So based on that and your experience from the field, your experience from like macro data analysis, what do you think could be done in that way instead, especially in looking at cultural and value, that is very difficult something to shift, even though we know it's a bit difficult to shift it, but sometimes when culture are very wrong, there's a need to shift it as well. So like, what are your views about it and like, what could be done and practice, in practice? Thank you.
Okay, so I will answer the first questions. No, we didn't. We were thinking about it, actually. But then the religion data that we would include would be categorical, probably, like, let's say 1 Christians, 2 Islams, and then 3. Maybe we should do it. Maybe we will do it. But I think our, how could I say? I think our worry was that we didn't want to suggest that one religion is better than others. This is a little bit, I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, let's talk about it and let's see. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I mean, it's just like we are too afraid to interpret the results if one religion's really showing that it actually discriminates women, and I don't know. Yeah.
If I should briefly add, I'll say, so societies are formed not just based on one thing. So there are cultural norms, of course there are religion as well. And for me, I see religion in this context as a double-edged sword. Because one way it comforts the woman. Let's say a woman have these abuses, a woman have so many things that she's going through, she gets this comfort. So if she gets comfort from religion and she goes to church on Sunday and the pastor is telling the woman, you need to be submissive to your husband, you see where the basis is coming from. So it's not, I think as social scientists, it's hard time, we can make interpretations, but to judge to where or to decide that these, so that's why I put it over there. We need to do rethinking with them. We need to think together with them. These are things that have sustained them. Because, for instance, when it comes to religion, when the Fulani cattle destroys another person's farm, one thing they do is to forgive, and that is coming from religion. Because in Ghana, there have been contests, people have shot, there are death cases. So religion, I think it's two double-edged sword. We need to find a balance, and the balance is integrating local actors or centering their perspective into our research. And I think that's what Fatima says, that the point or the way to start from is redefining concepts, not taking concepts, let's say, what do we even mean by sustainability? What do we mean by equality? What do we even mean by religion? I think it's a way forward for us to address these.
Very nice, Denise. So yeah, there are a lot of gaps that we can continue discussing about cultural norms and institutions and differences in religions throughout the world. So we thought that because we're all not gender scientists, we start with the little definitions to set the ground for our discussion. So we have these 3 definitions here about, as a group, we discussed together and came to agreeing on these 3 things. So the first one is that we see gender as a socially constructed set of roles that are associated with men and women, and we acknowledge that there are other genders, but here we start a discussion with these 2. As like this general framework of overall structure, we define patriarchy as the domination of men over other men and women, and then we emphasize that we're aware of other dimensions of discrimination and oppression that are within this framework of intersectionality. So race, class, and sexual orientation are other dimensions we should be aware of, which also probably should take part of this discussion. So with this, please, our panelists can have a seat here.
So we have a lot of distance between us. Maybe I'm just gonna get closer. Ha. Yeah, thank you so much for awesome presentation and a lot of questions coming from the audience. We see that. Okay, we're okay. Yeah, okay. We've heard a lot of issues, a lot of different initiatives going on related to gender, in respect to gender, linked to land system. But we still see that there's this like issues of visibility and invisibility, right? Like we don't know a lot about women, we don't know a lot about minorities, indigenous communities, and although at the same time, now we're seeing more and more grassroots movements. For example, in Brazil, farmers are looking for, are voicing their concerns about land access for women, and then also in Indonesia as well, similar movements are happening as well, right? But then all this information are very scattered. We know very little about what is going on, and then also how it links to land system science. And then we would like to take this opportunity to discuss with everyone here in the room to get your to pick your brain on several questions. But we also would like to listen to the speakers about these questions, what do you think are the main research gaps in understanding the role of gender and minority groups in land system science? Particularly related in relation to their portrayal and actual involvement in sustainable land use practices. So maybe we could start from, would you like to start? Yes.
Thank you. And thank you all for the contribution. I think if I'm overambitious, I'll say we are halfway through, because some of the responses that were coming from you answered or kind of put light on the question. To my thinking of this question, I think it's first we need to look at how we even define the concept gender, which we have mentioned, and also our binary categorization of male, woman. I think in our presentation we might have appeared to be talking about female. In my context, I talked about husband and wife. So I think intersectionality, it's one of the way forward to this, whereby we look at one person, not just as a person, let's say not just as a Fulani woman, but to recognize that she's a Fulani woman, she's from a minority group, to recognize that she can be married, she can be unmarried, she can be divorced. So there are so many sessions that frames her as even being a woman. And the same for the men. I think when we talk about gender, many people think it's only about the woman. In my case, even young people are living this out migration. So who is turning for the land? Because there's out migration till a Fulani man gets married. In their land system, you can even own the land, but if your father is still alive, you do not make decisions concerning the land. So if we can shift the focus first from our categorization of male women to make it broader, I think when it comes to policy-wise, it gets more complex. But that's why we improve upon policies. That's why we give feedbacks to policies, and that's what science stands for. Thank you.
I think the chance is if you do research about gender, the chances it will be novel in this discipline. I'm actually like, I was like discussing with some of you, like it's so surprising for me that this is the only gender session in this conference, and only 2 presenters. So it's I don't know, to me it's a bit weird. I'm coming from economics background. I think probably development economics is a little bit more advanced. I mean, in this sense, in this gender stuff, because usually if we have a parallel sessions in a conference, then the chances there's always one gender session, one gender session. Any you want? And no, I mean yeah, okay, and then. And then in economics also we have new subdisciplines called queer economics, and then this is also to see the intersectionalities. So it's not only male and female, but also now they also taken into account the intersectionalities. The research gap, I think I agree with what Eunice said about male and female, and also what you mentioned earlier in the beginning, like it's often segregated. Maybe we could also do some analysis. We don't always have to segregate between men and women, especially in the land system science. Yeah, I mentioned before that most farms are actually. This is also, I think, the limitation of my research. Most farms are actually managed jointly, and then we usually don't capture this. We usually only see, oh, this is men farms and then this is women farms, but we often don't capture the joint decisions that men and women make, for example. And I think this could be I think this is the one of the research gap in this topic. Yeah.
Very well. Yeah, I agree with you, both of you. Thank you very much. So I think there was already a comment over there.
Sorry for interrupting you, Daniel, with that hand. I coming a while ago from development economics, and something I also wanted to say in your the end of your presentation was it always used to make me feel incredibly uncomfortable when I was studying development economics that that gender was always discussed as an instrumental thing to achieve higher yields for global output and, you know, increase GDP. It was quite literally always framed as that. Like, here is some evidence that if you give women more rights, you'll get more money. And I wanted to say that this work's really, really important, but like how the conclusion is framed, I think is really important, because it can perpetuate these problems if we keep framing its relevance as an instrumental one, and it does make you uncomfortable as a woman when that is done, and it is so pertinent. So while development economics does gender a lot, like I felt it was always extremely lacking when it did gender, and as a woman studying it, it was actually directly kind of uncomfortable. I don't know enough about the entire field of like land system science, but I think some of the discussions, the fact they're more interdisciplinary and mixed with qualitative methods, mixed with critical approaches, different like definitions of what gender means that they often capture more than development economics. But of course there's some exciting work in economics too, like highlighting in data inequalities and inequities and things like that. But yeah, that was just a point on that. Did you have a comment on that you wanted?
I have just a comment to acknowledge and support what you're just saying, that development economists, the literature from development economists only doesn't say it. And I will not do justice to myself if I don't mention some of my work on gender relations and sustainable land use and sustainable agriculture intensification that I've done in the past, which is kind of providing some options of solutions to the questions we are raising here, especially when Casey asked about what can we do with cultural norms, and some of them needs to be changed. So I was involved in a project for 5 years where we look at sustainable agriculture intensification and gender aspect in land access and ownership. All of the publications are open access, you can go and check. And one of the things we've been asking about is how we can promote more gender transformative approaches, and the different ways in which gender transformative approaches have been packaged, and how those can be fostered in different contexts, considering also kinship system, which you haven't taken into consideration in your global model, because you can see something different in a patrilineal system and a matrilineal system, which you can see in both countries. For instance, in Malawi, you have both. Where I worked in, we have the patrilineal system and the matriarchal system in the southern. In Ghana, we also have the same thing. So we were working in Malawi and Ghana, comparing how those kinship system and religion and culture influence all of those things. So gender equality, coming back to what Eni said, what does it mean in such a complicated context? That's what we need to unpack, and what are those approaches we can use to work on things that we see not working. So that's my contribution.
I'll just try to respond to that. We want to unpack gender equality. So one concept that I often used to think about is agency. So trying to increase agencies of the local communities where also women are involved is one way to not impose, thank you, not impose any kind of definition that might be Western or colonial, but might just empower the local communities. I don't know if there's some responses to that.
Thanks to the two presenters for some really thought-provoking ideas. My name's Andrew. I'm from Curtin University, which is in Perth in Australia, and most of my work's with Australian Aboriginal people. And I was just interested in the panel's perspective on culture. So I think from an Australian Aboriginal perspective, you don't own land, you are land. And if you're an Australian Aboriginal person, you are country. You don't own country. And different role, the power of community comes from gender difference in some ways. So for example, women are responsible for burning, burning affects forage for kangaroos, men hunt kangaroos. If women aren't doing their job, men can't do their job. So there's a dependency there. The approaches that we've talked about here are very much white Western ideas of land tenure. And I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts on the way that traditional cultural perspectives on land might be addressed in your work? Because equality in the Western sense is not how Australian Aboriginal land management works effectively.
Thank you. Any replies to that? Or?
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a very good question. So in my earlier submission, I had mentioned that when it comes to culture and norms, these are inherent. So I think in my conclusion, I said that the people involved see this as God-given or natural order. And when people see things as natural order, that is to show this interdependence and how it has sustained them. So not that the people resist change, social transformation is ongoing, but these interdependencies have helped them to be, if I should use the word or borrow the word, sustainable or resilient. So the example that you mentioned, in my case, it happens. Women are the ones to burn trees. Then once the trees are been, because the woman is known to be always cooking by the fire, so she knows how to do the fire more than the man. Then once she finishes burning the tree, now the man will step in. So I think where we need to bring the conversation is not to make a conclusive decision that these interdependencies are not good. Because in the submissions that we have said, we mentioned like their way of living, their way of settings based on their traditional norms and on their values. So we also need to acknowledge that how they have lived has sustained them. But we have got to a stage that it's, so there are dynamics involved in it. And these dynamics is making some of them becoming more, if I should put it, more vulnerable or more marginalized. So these interdependencies are good. So I'm happy that you mentioned it. But to what extent does it put some of them on the peripheral? Or to what extent can we bring or think together with them to make sure that it's working together for their good? Because times have passed and societies have transformed. So if we still have these notions, if we still have these norms in our mind, how do we together with them think together? How do we together now bring the solutions together? So you are correct when you say that we bring these concepts of what's nice concept in their settings, because how they have lived, it's influenced by how their history is, and it has helped them over time. I don't know if I attempted the question.
I think let's go to the next question, because time is running. We only have 10 minutes left.
But maybe if you also have, probably you also have a contribution to your own question. What's your thinking about it?
Okay.
That was really cunning, wasn't it, to put it back on me? It's complex. So in Australia, there's large tracts of land being handed back to at least joint management, if not sole management, by Aboriginal people. And the way in which that land's managed from a cultural perspective, is in the way that communities might have operated 200 years ago, varies dramatically place to place. So some of them are cattle stations that might be owned by a corporation, and then it comes down to whether or not does a corporation have a board that's all men, or some of them allocate according to families, some of them allocate 50-50 according to gender. So it really varies dramatically. But a quick question for Daniel. Daniel's data sort of suggests that women are better farmers, which may be the case. So yeah, so I'm wondering what explains that? Like if you mine down into the data, because where women have better access, productivity seems to be higher. So so what explains, are women better farmers?
I don't know, I can't answer this. It's not, because it's global studies and I don't know what happened in each country. I don't want to say something wrong. Yeah. But maybe, yeah.
Okay, maybe we can kind of tweak that a little bit towards. Well, then we just skip the second methods question and maybe go through the third question and try to like integrate these replies. Where, yeah, I guess we can try to think together about the role of women in transformative change and link that back to, if women are better farmers or not. It's a complex question, but.
I'm very excited to reply to this question because I don't know if using the word better farmers is a good way to frame it, as opposed to if you think about kind of the types of agriculture that we are, as land system scientists, actively trying to work against, especially in the face of climate change and gender inequality. Really what it comes down to is industrial agriculture is a part of white supremacy and patriarchy and a part of this colonial lens that we are discussing. When you're talking about the agricultural revolution in whether or not it's the United States, whether or not it's in Africa, whether or not you're talking about how the Green Revolution impacted South Asia, which was discussed in another talk yesterday, a lot of people are so disconnected from their indigenous ways because of this imposed whiteness and patriarchy, because over time, that was seen as more civilized. Indigenous practices are seen as primitive and not correct, and so women might not necessarily be better farmers, but they're certainly way more connected in their history and their stories, because if you are together with other women around the fire, you're telling stories, you're sharing skills, you are typically the people who are educating children. And so when we're talking about, why is it that when women are given land access, the farms are better, it's because women are promoting agroecological techniques. They're not monocropping, they're typically using organic fertilizers, they're less likely to take inputs from corporations because they're not as trusting. They know how much damage it has done to their communities, and they want to get back to doing things in the traditional way because they know that the yields are better. So I think it's a matter of understanding, men are more likely to trust other men telling them, this new fertilizer is going to work for you, you should use it. Women are typically way more hesitant to accept that because it's coming from an outside space. If you're hearing from your grandma that this is the best fertilizer versus you're hearing from a corporation that this is the best fertilizer, they're going to be way more trusting of women's knowledge. And so I think that's a really important thing to mention.
Thank you.
Mine is a nuanced question. You're talking about access, and then we're talking about ownership. I think those are two different concepts here to understand. Is access ownership, and which one is security? I think, and then which one leads to equality? I think the nuances here to unpack and to be careful about. Right? So can you, maybe Daniel?
Access is not ownerships. So it's just access to, in my data access, it's just, there is a option to have, let's say, the land, but it's not necessarily they own the land. Yeah, so it's different. Exactly, one is access and one is provides more security with ownerships. Yeah.
So I'm so glad you guys organized this panel. I had to step out for a second, but I saw the talks and I heard of some of the discussion. But just to get back to this idea of transformative change and then the theme of the conference, pathways to sustainable and just land systems. And what I'd love to see is people coming away from this session and getting in contact with Adelina and Leonie and the other panelists, because I really think we need to bring more data to this subject, because the point I think in some of this is that in some cases there are trade-offs under the existing structures, and the idea of the transformative change is like that you need to tip into a new pathway to discover more synergies. Because a classic example in the literature is how women's land is constantly characterized as degraded. This came up earlier. And then that's used as a space for restoration. Well, that might lead to more sustainability, but less gender equity, under the existing structures and conventions. But what can we bring to this in terms of our research, in terms of mapping out where, under the existing system, there is a trade-off between the gender equity and the sustainability dimension? I think you have a lot of great data in yours, but we also need to bring like this grounded, really much more spatialized and hetero and granular understanding and bring in the cultural aspects and what people actually want. And then see and then if we really want to talk about transformative change, we then need to layer on like a bigger picture lens of how under existing systems they'll continue to be trade-offs, and it's only under certain changes that they could actually be synergistic. So that's like my call to you as one of the conference organizers, because I think this is a really rich space for us to go into in the future. Sorry, it was not a question.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's do it. There's a lot of work to do. I'm not yet sure like how to continue. How much time do we have left? Okay, let's try to wrap it up then. And like summarize what we found. Yeah, I think gender and all the other dimensions that were mentioned are for now underrepresented in land system sciences, and there should be a way and to step into that space and make it possible to one, like get more data, find more evidence, and then also develop the theory to be able to integrate that data into new land system models that are finding these sweet spots of different synergies that we talked about. I want to give this word to our speakers again.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge what pardon me, your name, what Rachel said. I think that's very true. And in my context, what I see is that like how most development organization comes to the field when we look at CBOs and NGOs. So we're trying to increase the agency of women, and we end up increasing rather these inequalities. For instance, an agency or an NGO may come to the field and decide that we cannot change this land ownership pattern. So what do? Let's increase the agency of women by giving them, let's say, life skills like weaving, life skills like sewing. In the long run, if these things are not also taken into consideration, you are thinking of giving them extra income, but it's also burdening these women, because they still have their roles to perform, their traditional roles to perform in the home. They still have a responsibility to go to where they are sewing, and they still have a responsibility to tend for their children. So it's good in its intention for an organization to, let's say, in my case, they have a cashew processing factory for these women, whereby they process their cashews. But when you have conversations with these women, you realize that just bringing a factory into the village does not really solve the problems that these women are going through, because at the long run, it's rather increasing their roles or their norms, because they take this in addition to their traditional roles. So I think it calls a lot of research, and I'm glad we all have this passion to unpack it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that brings us back to like that first dichotomy we talk about, that women are not the victims and not the heroines, but somewhere in between, and we really have to impact that issue. So thank you very much for coming.
I just want to appreciate everybody, because personally this has been like the most engaging and I don't know, I guess just like exciting session that I've gone to in this entire conference. I really appreciated kind of like you being flexible with allowing us to ask questions, even though we got kind of off track with the questions. So I just want to thank everybody for their input.